Sister Margareta Hoffman always believed that God had a plan for her. At 34, she had devoted the last 12 years of her life to the convent of the Sisters of Mercy in Münster, a life of prayer, silence, and devotion that she had embraced fervently after a turbulent youth. What no one knew was that behind that grey habit and the rosary always in her hands was a woman with a past she had tried to bury in the depths of her faith. The convent was a peaceful refuge in the heart of Germany. Its centuries-old stone walls housed 23 sisters, each with her own story of divine calling. Margaret stood out among them not only for her natural beauty, which the veil could not completely hide, but also for her tireless dedication to online missionary work. She managed the convent's website, social media, and digital charity programs that connected that closed community with the outside world. It was through this virtual window that she met Omar Hassan, a 41-year-old man who introduced himself as a Christian businessman born in Egypt but based in Germany for over a decade. The first messages arrived in March 2023, when Omar made a generous donation to the convent's humanitarian aid program. "I admire the work you do," he wrote. "As a Coptic Christian, I know the value of true devotion." Margaret responded with the formal courtesy typical of a nun, thanking him for his generosity and offering prayers. But Omar was not like other donors. His messages were eloquent, full of biblical references and philosophical questions about faith and purpose that spoke directly to the nun's intellectual heart. He talked about his own spiritual journey, about how he had lost and rediscovered God, about the loneliness he felt even when surrounded by people. "Sister Margaret," he wrote in one of those early conversations, "have you ever wondered if God calls us not only to serve within the walls of a convent, but also outside, in the world that so badly needs divine light?" The question echoed in her mind for days. It was exactly the kind of doubt she had been secretly harboring, especially after her younger sister Julia had died of cancer the previous year, leaving behind 3 young children whom Margaret barely knew due to her religious seclusion. The online conversations became more frequent. Omar revealed details of his life. He was married to a German woman named Petra, they had 2 teenage daughters, and he ran an import-export company that did business between Germany and the Middle East. But the marriage was in crisis, he explained. Petra did not understand his renewed faith, mocked his prayers, and treated him more as a financial provider than as a beloved husband. "Sometimes I feel like God has put a barrier between me and my family," Omar confessed in a particularly emotional message. "Petra threatens to leave me and take the girls away from me. She says I've become a religious fanatic, but how can I deny Christ after all he has done for me?" Margaret felt her heart ache as she read these words. Here was a man struggling to maintain his faith amid family abandonment, the exact opposite of her journey, who had abandoned everything for God. For months, they exchanged daily messages. Omar sent photos from his business trips to Egypt, images of ancient Coptic churches, Bible verses in Arabic and German, always accompanied by profound reflections on suffering and redemption. Margaret found herself eagerly awaiting each notification, each new message that brightened her monastic routine. The Mother Superior, Sister Teresa, a 67-year-old woman with piercing eyes that nothing escaped, began to notice changes in Margaret. The young nun spent more time in the computer office, smiled more often, and seemed distracted during collective prayers. "Margaret, my child," Teresa said to her one June afternoon, "you seem different. Is there something you would like to share?" Margaret hesitated. How could she explain that she had found in a stranger on the internet a spiritual connection she had never felt even in 12 years of religious life? How could she admit that Omar's words touched parts of her soul that she thought she had sacrificed forever on the altar of her vocation? It's the online missionary work, Mother. I'm meeting people who really need spiritual guidance. I feel that God is using our digital ministry in ways I never imagined. The partially truthful answer satisfied Teresa temporarily, but Margaret knew she was walking on dangerous ground, especially since Omar had begun to hint at personal encounters. "I'll be in Münster next week for business meetings," he wrote at the end of June. "I know it would be inappropriate, but would it be possible for us to meet, just to talk in person about the charity projects? I have some proposals that could greatly help the convent." Margaret spent 3 whole days praying, fasting, and seeking divine signs. On the 4th morning, while reading the Gospel of Luke during morning prayer, her eyes fell on the passage where Jesus says, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." Was it a sign, a warning, or a confirmation that she needed to move forward, even if it meant questioning everything she believed in? The following afternoon, for the first time in 12 years, Sister Margaret Hoffmann left the convent without official permission, saying only that she was going to the pharmacy to pick up medicine for the infirmary. Instead, she went to Café Extrablatt in Münster's historic center, where a dark-haired man with kind eyes was waiting for her with a Bible on the table and a smile that seemed to promise all the answers she was looking for. What she didn't know was that this simple meeting in a German cafe would be the first step on a journey that would take her across 2 continents, cost her everything she held sacred, and end in a way that even her worst nightmares could not have predicted. Because Omar Hassan had his own plans, and they did not include the spiritual salvation he had promised. Margaret arrived at Café Extrablatt 15 minutes before the appointed time, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the rosary inside the pocket of the civilian coat she had borrowed from Sister Claudia. It was the first time in over a decade that she had worn secular clothing, and the feeling of freedom was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. She had chosen a table in the back, away from the windows, where she could observe without being seen. When Omar entered, she recognized him immediately from the photos he had sent, but the reality surpassed any digital image. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark Italian-cut suit perfectly. His dark hair had streaks of gray at the temples that gave him an air of seductive maturity, and when his eyes met hers across the crowded room, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 20, pure, uncontrollable desire. "Sister Margaret," he said, approaching her with a warm smile, "you are even more beautiful than I imagined." She blushed instantly, lowering her eyes. "Please just call me Margaret when we are like this." He laughed softly, a deep sound that reverberated in her chest. Margaret, then, a beautiful name for a beautiful woman. They talked for 3 hours that felt like 3 minutes. Omar was everything she had imagined and more: eloquent, passionate about his faith, deeply knowledgeable about the scriptures, and above all, genuinely interested in every word she said. They talked about theology, about God's purpose for their lives, about how they both felt misunderstood in their respective worlds. "You know," Omar said, leaning across the small table, "since I started talking to you, I feel like I finally found someone who understands my soul. Petra. She mocks me when she sees me praying. She says I'm a hypocrite because I do business with Muslims in Egypt but profess Christianity here." His eyes filled with a genuine sadness that made Margaret's heart ache. "Sometimes I think God gave me this marriage as a trial, like Job was tested." Margaret instinctively reached out, lightly touching his hand on the table. The electric contact made her quickly withdraw her fingers, but Omar gently held her hand. "Don't be ashamed," he whispered. "God created human touch as a form of comfort. Jesus touched the sick, comforted the women who wept. There is holiness in genuine care." The theological rationalization reassured her, allowing her to maintain contact. His hand was warm, strong, with calluses that spoke of honest work. "What about you, Margaret? Have you ever felt alone, isolated behind those walls?" The question struck her like a well-aimed arrow. "Every day," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Especially after my sister died. I feel like I wasted precious years that I could have spent getting to know my nephews, being a present aunt." "See, God is speaking through you," said Omar, gently squeezing her hand. "Perhaps your true calling is not to hide from the world, but to go out into it, to bring light to the dark corners where people suffer without hope." His words echoed exactly the thoughts she had been secretly harboring, the questions that kept her awake during her nightly vigils. When they said goodbye at the cafe entrance, Omar kissed her lightly on the forehead, a gesture that could have been interpreted as paternal, if not for the way his lips lingered on her skin. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "I have a concrete proposal for a missionary project that could change your life and the lives of many people in need." Margaret returned to the convent in a trance. During evening prayers, she could hardly concentrate. Her mind filled with images of Omar's smile, the tone of his voice, the warmth of his hands. Sister Teresa noticed her distraction and, after a silent dinner, called her aside for a private conversation. "Margaret, you left today without permission," Teresa said directly. "The pharmacist called asking about the medicine you were supposed to pick up." Margaret's heart sank. I got distracted, Mother. I met one of our online donors who was passing through town. He wanted to discuss charity projects in person." Teresa studied her face for a long moment. "My child, for 12 years I have watched you grow spiritually within these walls. You have always been obedient, dedicated, an example to the younger sisters, but in recent weeks..." She sighed deeply. "Promise me that if something is disturbing your inner peace, you will come and talk to me before making any rash decisions." "I promise, Mother," Margaret lied, knowing she could never explain the whirlwind of emotions Omar had awakened in her. That night, kneeling in her Spartan cell, she tried to pray for divine clarity. But her prayers were interrupted by the sound of her cell phone, something that rarely rang after 9 o'clock at night. It was a message from Omar. "I can't stop thinking about our meeting today. You are an extraordinary woman, Margaret. God has great plans for us. Together." Attached to the message was a photo of him in a Coptic church in Cairo, kneeling before an ornate altar, his hands clasped in prayer. He looked like a medieval saint, a modern martyr struggling to keep his faith in a hostile world. She typed and deleted a reply dozens of times before finally sending, "I can't stop thinking about it either. I need to understand what God's will is for my life. You said you had a proposal?" The reply came in seconds. "Come to Egypt with me, Margaret. There is a Coptic convent in Cairo that needs someone with your skills. You could make a real difference in the lives of orphaned children, abused women. Imagine the impact you could have away from the limitations and obsolete traditions of the German convent." Margaret read the message 3 times before its real implications sank in. Omar was suggesting that she leave everything behind, abandon her consecrated life to follow him to the other side of the world. It was an insane, impossible proposal, completely contrary to everything on which she had based her adult existence. So why was her heart racing with excitement instead of horror? For 2 weeks after receiving Omar's proposal, Margaret lived in a state of spiritual turmoil that left her exhausted. She slept poorly, ate little, and her prayers turned into desperate pleas for divine guidance. Every sign seemed contradictory. A dove that landed on her window during morning prayer could mean peace or departure. The Bible verse of the day about leaving father and mother could be about religious vocation or about following a different calling. Omar, sensing her hesitation, intensified his contacts. His messages arrived every few hours, always at the perfect moment, as if he knew exactly when she was most vulnerable. "Margaret, my angel," he wrote on a rainy Tuesday, "I spent the whole night praying for you. I had a clear vision. You and I, side by side, saving lost souls in the Egyptian desert. God is calling us to something greater than our fears." Attached to the messages were increasingly personal photos. Omar, praying in what he said was his apartment in Cairo, with a photo of Jesus Christ on the wall and an open Bible on a simple table. Omar distributing food to Egyptian street children, his face lit up with Christian compassion. Omar standing in front of a small school that, according to him, desperately needed qualified teachers who spoke German and Arabic. "The school principal was moved when I told him about you," Omar lied skillfully. "He said that an educated German nun would be a blessing from God for these orphan children. Margaret, don't you understand? This is no coincidence. It is divine providence." The words echoed in her ears during the long hours of convent silence, planting seeds of a dangerous conviction. The turning point came during a phone conversation that Omar insisted on having. "I need to hear your voice," he said. "Text messages can't convey how I feel about our mission." It was Sunday evening, and Margaret was alone in the convent office, supposedly updating the institutional website. Omar's voice was even more seductive in person, deep, affectionate, imbued with a subtle accent that made every word more exotic and appealing. They talked for over an hour, and he painted such a vivid picture of his life in Egypt that Margareta could almost feel the heat of the desert, hear the call to morning prayer echoing from the minarets, see the hopeful faces of the children she could help. "My dear," Omar said, his voice becoming more intimate, "you know that my marriage is only on paper, right? Petra and I have been sleeping in separate rooms for 2 years. She's having an affair with her personal trainer, Henrik. I have proof, but I don't want to destroy my family publicly." Margaret felt a confusing mixture of relief and excitement. If Omar was emotionally available, then maybe— "Don't think that way," he interrupted, as if reading her thoughts. "Our connection is spiritual, pure. We are soldiers of Christ fighting the same battle, but I admit that I have never felt such a deep connection with anyone. You awaken in me a devotion that I thought I had lost forever." That same night, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. She wrote a 2-page letter to Mother Teresa, explaining that she had received a missionary calling to work with persecuted Christians in the Middle East. She vaguely mentioned an ecclesiastical contact who would facilitate her transfer to a Coptic convent in Cairo, where her language skills and knowledge of technology would be crucial in helping Christian refugees. The letter was a masterpiece of semi-conscious manipulation. Margaret used all her theological education to biblically ground her decision, citing the apostles who left everything to preach in distant lands, missionaries who sacrificed comfort and security to bring Christ to the needy. She knew that Teresa, despite her suspicions, could not argue against a genuine missionary calling without appearing hypocritical. But Margaret did not deliver the letter immediately. First, she needed to make practical arrangements that no nun should know how to make. Using the convent's computers, she discreetly researched visas for Egypt, currency conversions, and international travel insurance. Omar had offered to pay all expenses, but she wanted to understand exactly what she was getting herself into. It was during one of these searches that she found the first disturbing piece of information. Searching for Omar Hassan businessman import Egypt Germany on Google, she found only vague and contradictory results. There was an Omar Hassan listed as the director of a small company in Berlin, but the photo in the commercial registry showed a man at least 10 years older and visibly different. There was another Omar Hassan mentioned in a newspaper article about immigration fraud, but the article was in Arabic and she couldn't translate it completely. When she questioned Omar about these inconsistencies, he laughed carelessly. "Margaret, my dear, you don't understand how international business works. I use different business names for different projects. It's perfectly legal and very common in the Arab world. Besides, there are dozens of Omar Hassans in the world. It's an extremely common name in Egypt." The explanation made sense, but it planted a seed of doubt that Margaret desperately tried to ignore. Omar noticed her hesitation and immediately changed tactics. "If you're concerned about my identity," he said during a tense phone conversation, "we can meet again. I can show you my documents, my passport, anything you need to feel secure." The second meeting took place at a more discreet restaurant on the outskirts of Münster. Omar arrived with a briefcase full of documents: Egyptian passport, German visa, company documents, even photos of his family that corroborated his story. Everything looked legitimate, professional, convincing. Margareta felt ashamed for having doubted him. "I understand your caution," Omar said, gently touching her face. "A woman as pure and good as you must be wary of the corrupt world outside. But trust me, Margareta, trust in what God is building between us." He kissed her forehead again, but this time his lips moved down to her cheeks, dangerously close to her mouth. Margaret didn't pull away. For the first time in 12 years, she allowed herself to feel the warmth of a man, the scent of his expensive cologne, the rough texture of his stubble against her skin. It was sinful, she knew, but it felt like salvation. "When do we leave?" she asked, surprising herself with her own courage. Omar smiled, a smile she would later remember as predatory, but which she interpreted at that moment as triumphant. "Next week. I've already bought the tickets. Trust me, Margaret. Trust in God's plan for us." Margaret left the convent on a grey September morning, carrying only a small suitcase with civilian clothes she had secretly bought and her personal Bible, the same one she had received as a gift at her first communion at age 12. The letter to Mother Teresa was on her bed, along with her carefully folded habit and the rosary she had used for over a decade. Omar was waiting for her at Düsseldorf airport with a beaming smile and 2 first-class tickets to Cairo. "My angel," he said, kissing her hands, "today our real life begins." Margaret tried to return his enthusiasm, but she felt a strange knot in her stomach that she attributed to nerves about the international trip. During the 4-hour flight, Omar was the perfect companion, attentive, affectionate, constantly reassuring her about the courageous decision they had made. He showed her photos on his tablet of what their new life would be like: the modern apartment in Cairo where they would stay temporarily, the Coptic convent where she would work, the smiling children she would help educate. "You'll see," Omar said, holding her hand as the plane flew over the Mediterranean. "God has prepared something very special for us. The director of the convent, Father Anba Marcos, is eager to meet you. He said that an educated German nun will be a blessing to the community." Margaret smiled, imagining what it would be like to work with children again, something she hadn't done since her early years as a novice. But when they landed at Cairo International Airport, the first cracks in Omar's facade began to appear. He became visibly nervous at customs, sweating profusely as the Egyptian officer examined his documents. He spoke rapidly in Arabic to the official, gesturing agitatedly. Margaret didn't understand the conversation, but she noticed that the officer seemed suspicious. "Bureaucratic problems," Omar explained vaguely when they finally left the airport. "Sometimes they make things difficult for citizens living abroad." But Margaret noticed that he kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. The taxi that took them through the city was a shocking revelation. The Cairo that Omar had described in his romanticized messages did not exist. Instead of the clean streets and elegant colonial buildings she had imagined, she found a chaotic, polluted megalopolis with traffic jams and beggars on every corner. The smell of car exhaust mixed with spices and burning garbage was almost unbearable. "Is it different from what you expected?" Omar asked, noticing her expression. "Big cities in the Middle East have their own charm. You'll get used to it." "Nas." But when they arrived at the address that was supposed to be his apartment, they found a dilapidated residential building in a clearly low-income neighborhood, a far cry from the modern business district he had described. "There was a problem with the main apartment," Omar explained quickly. "A water leak. We'll stay here temporarily in my cousin's apartment." The two-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor was furnished with cheap, used pieces. The windows looked out onto a dark, smelly inner courtyard. There was no working air conditioning despite the stifling September heat in Cairo. Margaret sat on the hard bed in the smaller bedroom and tried to process what was happening. Nothing matched what Omar had promised. "Where is the convent?" she asked. "When can I meet Father Anba Marcos?" Omar hesitated visibly for the first time. "Well, there's a slight complication. The priest is traveling to Upper Egypt this week. He'll be back next Monday. Until then, we can get to know each other better." He moved closer to her on the bed, his eyes shining with an intention that was anything but spiritual. "Omar." "No," Margarete said, instinctively pulling away. "It's not appropriate. We're missionary partners, not—" He laughed, but it wasn't a gentle sound like before. "Margaret, my dear, you're no longer a nun. You left that life behind. Now you're a free woman, with me, in a land where no one knows or judges you." That night, while Omar slept in the master bedroom, Margaret lay awake in the uncomfortable bed, finally allowing her repressed doubts to surface. She used the apartment's spotty Wi-Fi to try to search for information about the Coptic convent that was supposedly waiting for her. She found absolutely nothing. There was no record of a Father Anba Marcos in any religious directory she could access. Even more alarming, when she finally managed to access her email from the German convent, she found a desperate message from Mother Teresa. "Margaret, please respond immediately. We are very concerned. We cannot find any information about the Coptic convent you mentioned. Please tell us where you are and that you are okay." Margaret began to type a reply, but was interrupted by Omar, who had woken up and was standing in the doorway, watching her. "Who are you talking to, dear?" he asked, but his voice had a tone she had never heard before. Cold, controlling. "Just reassuring my sisters that I arrived safely," she lied. Omar approached and closed the laptop gently but firmly. "It's best to cut those ties to the past," he said. "You're in a new life now, with me, and it would be best not to give information about our location to people who don't understand our mission." For the first time since she had met Omar, Margaret felt real fear. It wasn't just disappointment or disillusionment. It was a primal terror that rose from her stomach and made her tremble. "Omar," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I need to know more about this convent. I need to see documents, meet the people I'll be working with." He studied her for a long moment, as if making an important decision. Then he smiled, the same charming smile she had fallen in love with, but now she could see the falseness behind it. "Of course, my love. Tomorrow I'll take you to meet some people. You'll see that everything is exactly as I promised." But Margaret knew, with a certainty that chilled her blood, that Omar was lying. And for the first time in her adult life, she found herself completely alone, in a foreign country, without money, without documents. Omar had kept her passport for security, and with a man she was beginning to suspect she knew absolutely nothing about. That night, while pretending to sleep, Margaret prayed more fervently than she had in years, but her prayers were no longer ones of gratitude or spiritual contemplation. They were desperate pleas from a woman who was beginning to understand that she had made the biggest mistake of her life and that it might already be too late to correct it. The following days turned into a slow and suffocating nightmare. Omar woke up every morning with different excuses for not taking her to the convent. Father Anba Marcos was ill. There were protests in the city that made it dangerous to go out. The transfer documents were delayed in Egyptian bureaucracy. Each explanation sounded more false than the last, but Margaret had no way of verifying any information. Omar had established a carefully controlled routine. He left early every morning, claiming business meetings, and returned in the late afternoon with groceries and empty promises. He locked the door when he left. "For your safety," he explained. "The neighborhood can be dangerous for a foreign woman alone." Margaret tried to protest, but he was adamant. "Margarete, you don't understand this country like I do," he said, with a firmness that bordered on aggression. "Blonde German women are targets for criminals and extremists. I'm protecting you. Uli." When she insisted she wanted to go out, he showed her news stories on his cell phone about tourists being attacked in Cairo, selectively translating the most alarming parts. Alone in the stuffy apartment, Margaret spent hours trying to understand her situation. She used the intermittent Wi-Fi to obsessively research Omar Hassan, but the information remained contradictory and scarce. Worse still, she discovered that her German credit card had been blocked. Apparently, Omar had used her information to make some necessary transactions without asking for permission. "It was a misunderstanding," he explained when confronted. "I had to pay some consular fees to regularize your situation here. You'll reimburse me when you start working at the convent." But when she asked for concrete dates, he became evasive and irritable. The situation deteriorated rapidly in the second week. Omar began coming home smelling of alcohol and women's perfume. His excuses about business meetings became more elaborate and less convincing. One night, when Margaret questioned him directly about his activities, he exploded in anger for the first time. "You have no right to question me," he shouted, punching the wall. "I left my family, risked my business, spent a fortune to bring you here, and all I get is complaints and mistrust." Margaret had never seen this side of him. His eyes bloodshot, his face contorted with rage, his fists clenched. It was as if a mask had fallen away, revealing a dangerous stranger. "Omar, please," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I just want to understand what's going on. When can I start working? When can I meet the people at the convent?" He laughed, but it was a bitter, humorless sound. "The convent? Margaret, my dear fool, there is no convent. There never was." The words hit her like a physical punch. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Omar moved closer, his breath reeking of cheap arak. "I mean you're a romantic idiot who believed every sweet word I said. I mean you're here now, with me, and you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do." Margaret tried to run for the door, but Omar grabbed her by the wrist. "Where are you going to run to, Margaret? You have no money, no passport, you don't speak Arabic, you don't know anyone in this city. I am all you have now." His fingers tightened until they left purple marks on her skin. "You'd better start treating me with the respect I deserve." That night, for the first time since she had arrived in Egypt, Margaret cried until she had no more tears left. She had abandoned a lifetime of security and purpose to follow a man who did not exist. The kind and devoted Omar she had met online was a carefully constructed fiction. In his place was a violent stranger who saw her as his possession. In the days that followed, Margaret desperately tried to find a way out. She managed to access her email while hiding in the bathroom, using Omar's cell phone while he slept. She sent a cryptic message to Mother Teresa. "I'm in trouble. Cairo is not what I expected. I need help to get back." But when she checked again, she discovered that Omar had changed all the passwords to her accounts. "Did you take my phone without permission?" He confronted her, holding the device as evidence. "That's theft, Margaret. In Egypt, women can be arrested for stealing from the men who support them." It was a lie, she knew, but the threat terrified her. He had confiscated her only means of communication with the outside world. The situation worsened when Omar began bringing visitors to the apartment. Men who spoke in whispered Arabic, smoked smelly cigarettes, and looked at Margarete in a way that made her cringe with disgust. "Business friends," Omar explained casually. "Don't worry about them." But Margarete overheard fragments of conversations that alarmed her. Although she did not speak Arabic fluently, she recognized a few words from her theological studies: woman, German, money, sell. During one of these meetings, she clearly heard Omar say a price in US dollars, followed by male laughter that made her shudder. The final revelation came on a stifling Thursday. Margarete was hiding in her room when she heard Omar speaking on the phone in English, probably thinking she wouldn't understand. Yes, blonde German, educated, 34 years old. No family looking for her. She was a nun. Can you believe it? Very docile, easy to control. Price, $15,000, non-negotiable. Margarete covered her mouth to stifle a scream of horror. Omar wasn't just holding her prisoner. He was trying to sell her. To whom? For what purpose? All the terrible stories about human trafficking she had read in her charity work came back to her with terrifying clarity. That night, while Omar slept heavily after a night of drinking, Margarete made the most courageous decision of her life. She would try to escape. She found some Egyptian banknotes that Omar had left on the table, put her Bible in her pocket, and waited until she was sure he was fast asleep. The front door had 3 different locks, but she managed to open 2 of them silently. The third, however, jammed with a metallic noise that echoed through the quiet apartment. Margarete froze, listening intently. After a few eternal seconds of no movement from the bedroom, she continued working on the lock. Finally, she managed to open the door and stepped out into the dark hallway. Her hands trembled as she closed the door softly behind her. The stairwell was dimly lit and smelled of urine and garbage, but it represented freedom. She began to tiptoe down the 5 flights of stairs, her heart beating so loudly that she feared it might wake the entire building. When she reached the ground floor and opened the heavy door leading to the street, the hot Cairo dawn air hit her like a wave. It was approximately 3 in the morning, and the streets were relatively deserted. Margarete had no idea where she was or where to go, but she knew that anywhere would be better than that apartment that had become her prison. The streets of Cairo at 3 in the morning were a maze of shadows and dangers Margarete could not imagine. She walked quickly through the narrow alleys, trying to orient herself by the crescent moon shining between the dilapidated buildings. Every sound made her jump. A cat knocking over trash, distant voices of night workers, the occasional roar of a car passing by on the main street. After wandering for nearly an hour, she found a small mosque with lights on. An elderly man was sweeping the courtyard, preparing for the Fajr prayer. Margarete approached hesitantly, trying to remember the few words of Arabic she knew. "Please," she said in broken English mixed with Arabic, "I need phone. Police." The man studied her suspiciously. A disheveled Western woman, clearly panicked in the early hours of the morning, was not a common sight. He shook his head and pointed away, muttering something she didn't understand. Margarete insisted, showing him the purple marks on her wrists, trying to explain her situation with desperate gestures. Finally, the man seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He took her inside the mosque and offered her water, while quickly discussing the matter with another man who had arrived for prayer. They spoke in Arabic for several minutes, occasionally glancing at Margarete with expressions of concern and confusion. One of them picked up an old cell phone and began dialing, but before he could complete the call, they heard the sound of tires screeching in the street. Omar had discovered her escape. Margarete immediately recognized the roar of the engine of the car he had rented. Her blood ran cold as she heard doors slamming and male voices shouting in Arabic. "He found me," she whispered, grabbing the older man's arm. Please help me." But it was too late. Omar burst through the mosque entrance with two men Margaret recognized from the business meetings in the apartment. Their faces were contorted with rage and something worse, a cold determination that terrified her. Omar spoke quickly with the men from the mosque, his voice alternating between respectful and threatening tones. Margaret didn't need to understand Arabic to know that he was lying, making up some story about her being his unstable, perhaps mentally disturbed wife who had run away during a crisis. The elderly man looked from Omar to Margaret, clearly confused and uncomfortable with the situation. Margaret tried to protest, but one of Omar's men silenced her with a look that promised violence. "Come, Margaret," Omar said in German, his voice dangerously calm. "You are causing embarrassment to these good people. Let's go home." "I won't," she shouted in German, then tried in English, "Help me, he kidnapped me." But the men from the mosque didn't understand, and Omar's version of a foreign wife in crisis seemed more plausible to them than the unbelievable truth. Omar approached her and grabbed her arm hard enough to leave new marks. "If you don't come with me now," he whispered in her ear, "these men here will suffer the consequences of your rebellion. Do you want the deaths of innocent people on your conscience?" The threat worked. Margaret couldn't bear the thought that her attempt to escape might result in violence against people who had tried to help her. She allowed Omar to take her back to the car under the confused but resigned glances of the men from the mosque. The trip back was a silent nightmare. Omar drove with terrifying calm, while the other two men flanked Margaret in the back seat. None of them spoke during the 20 minutes it took to reach the apartment, but Margaret could feel the anger and something even more dangerous emanating from Omar. Back at the apartment, Omar dismissed his companions with a few words in Arabic. When the door closed, leaving them alone, he turned to Margaret with an expression she would never forget. It was no longer anger, but a calculated coldness that made her shiver. "You have disappointed me deeply, Margaret," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I thought you were smarter than that, more grateful." He walked slowly around her, like a predator assessing its prey. "Now I must take measures to ensure that this never happens again." Margaret tried to run to the bathroom, but Omar easily caught up with her. The struggle was brief and one-sided. She was no match for his physical strength. When she woke up hours later, she was tied up with ropes in the smaller bedroom, her mouth covered with duct tape. For the next few days, Margaret remained a prisoner in the dark room. Omar brought her water and small amounts of food, but barely spoke to her. She could hear constant conversations in the apartment, men coming and going, negotiations in Arabic that became more urgent with each passing day. One morning, Omar entered the room with a different expression, almost sad. "Things have changed, Margaret," he said, untying her legs. "My associates were not happy with your escape attempt. They no longer trust that you can be properly managed." He helped her sit up, removing the tape from her mouth with almost gentle care. "We're going on a trip," he continued, "to a place where you will be appreciated by people who understand your value." Margaret knew he was talking about the final sale, the delivery to whoever had bought her freedom and her life. "Please, Omar," she whispered, her voice hoarse after days of silence. "I won't try to escape again. I'll do anything you want. Just don't hand me over to them." Tears streamed down her face as she begged for mercy from a man who had lost all trace of humanity. Omar studied her for a long moment. "It's too late for that now," he said finally. "You made your choice when you tried to run away. The consequences have already been set in motion." That afternoon, they left the apartment for the last time. Omar drove for hours through the Egyptian desert, following increasingly isolated roads. Margaret, sitting in the passenger seat with her hands tied, watched the barren landscape stretch endlessly in all directions. There was nothing but sand, rocks, and the occasional skeleton of a dead animal. When they finally stopped, the sun was setting, tinging the desert blood red. There were no buildings in sight, only rolling dunes that disappeared into the horizon. Omar turned off the engine, and they sat in silence for several minutes, listening only to the hot wind blowing against the car. "This is where your journey ends, Margaret," Omar said, his voice strangely gentle again. "Where you will find the peace you were looking for." He got out of the car and went to the trunk, from which he took a shovel. Margaret immediately understood what was going to happen. There would be no sale, no trafficking. Omar had decided she was too much of a problem to be left alive. The tears stopped flowing. She had cried them all out. Instead, she felt a strange calmness come over her. When Omar opened the passenger door, she spoke for the last time. "May I pray?" He hesitated, then nodded. Margaret closed her eyes, held her Bible to her chest, and murmured the Lord's Prayer in German, her voice carried away by the desert wind. 2 weeks later, Bedouins found the remains of a small camp in the desert, a few tire tracks almost erased by the sand, fragments of fabric caught in thorny bushes, and a German Bible, its pages yellowed by the sun but still legible. Egyptian authorities recorded the find, but without a body or concrete evidence of a crime, the case was filed as a missing person. In Germany, the convent of the Sisters of Mercy continued to pray for Margaret Hoffmann, waiting for news that never came. The Bible was eventually sent to the German consulate in Cairo, where it remains to this day in an archive, along with hundreds of other belongings of German citizens who disappeared abroad. It is the only silent testimony of a woman who sought divine purpose and found human evil in its purest form.